Alrighty, thank you so much for that introduction, Cody, and thank you to the Draper Natural History Museum for inviting me. I'm so honored to be here and so excited to talk to you all about one of my favorite animals. So, in the history of North American grasslands, the last 200 years, 150 years, have really been an anomaly. Prior to their widespread decimation in the 1800s, the prairie was covered in an estimated 30 to 60 million bison, and they ranged from Canada to Mexico and nearly coast to coast. Modern studies, oral traditions, and the experiences of anyone who lives closely with bison will tell you the transformative impact that they have on the landscapes that they co-evolved with. An adult bison eats between 50 and 30 pounds of dry vegetation daily. They're ruminants with 4 stomachs, like, oh, whoops. Thank you for letting me know. There we go. Okay. So I was just saying that adult bison eat between 50 and 30 pounds of dry vegetation daily. They're ruminants like cattle with 4 stomachs. And while they eat a diversity of plant species, 90% of their diet is made up of grasses. So their intense grazing suppresses grasses, which gives flowering plants more of a competitive opportunity to establish increasing plant biodiversity. The historic grazing patterns of millions of bison across the prairie would have created a mosaic of vegetation heights as they intensively grazed an area and then moved on. Many modern cattle rotational grazing systems are designed to mimic the patterns of our native ungulates. While cattle grazing can approximate some of the impacts of bison, other behaviors are unique to bison. Wallowing is this behavior you see here, where they roll on the ground, and they do this to help shed fur in the spring, get relief from biting insects, and as part of their mating displays. It creates these bare patches of soil, like you can see where the arrows are pointing to this drone imagery we've collected. In the spring, if you walk through the prairie, you'll see it's covered with shed from their winter coats. Their incredibly dense fur helps them tolerate incredibly cold temperatures, and that fur then sloughs off in the spring and provides important nesting material for prairie songbirds. Cowbirds, which should probably be called buffalo birds, are among the species that follow the herd and eat the insects that they stir up when they graze. Bison create habitat that supports a really wide variety of prairie species. And these were all camera trap images that were collected from our bison pastures at American Prairie. And this was as part of a study to see what happens after a bison visit an area, who comes next. But unfortunately, there weren't really any images of what comes after a bison, because we have a lot of sequences like this. If I've learned anything about bison, it is that they are itchy. They love a scratching post. So these cameras, which we put on rebar posts, tend to get knocked over. So this little anecdote about the perils of doing science. So we see that there are a lot of ways that buffalo shape the prairie for the better. But unfortunately, bison populations were decimated so quickly that we actually recorded very little Western science information about their behavior or migratory patterns from when bison were truly free roaming. Even the degree to which they migrated in different parts of their range is still widely unknown. By 1870, their range had shrunk to that darker orange color you see on the map, and it was split in 2 by the first transcontinental railroad. By 1890, they only existed in those black dots on the map that you kind of have to squint to see. And this decimation of buffalo was not an accident. What you're looking at here is a mountain of bison skulls photographed in the 1890s that were waiting to be processed in a sugar refinery in Michigan. Hides were used for machinery belts, and bones were ground into fertilizer to fuel the Industrial Revolution. But the majority of bison were actually shot and left to rot on the prairie. Often only their hides or their tongues were taken. U.S. Army soldiers handed out free munition to civilian hunters, and trains stopped so civilians could shoot bison for sport out of their windows. But there's an even darker reason for this systematic extermination. The Plains nations depended on buffalo for their food, shelter, clothing, tools, and ceremony. Removing the source of their nomadic livelihoods made it easier to force tribes onto reservations. So in a single generation, the animal that had shaped the ecology of America's grasslands and the entire continent was brought to the brink of extinction. By the beginning of the 1900s, there were fewer than 500 buffalo remaining. So this is a postcard photo taken of the 25 or so remaining wild buffalo in Yellowstone's Pelican Valley. The population today has climbed back up to over 20,000 bison in conservation herds and many more in production ranching herds. And much of that recovery has been led by tribal nations. The Intertribal Buffalo Council was founded in 1992 and represents more than 80 tribes across roughly 20 states, as you can see mapped out on the left here. And tribal nations steward thousands of bison. The Department of the Interior also manages around 11,000 bison. You can see the herds mapped out here in beautiful areas like Yellowstone, Badlands, and Wind Cave National Park. So while this is a huge conservation success story, almost every bison herd in North America lives inside of a fence or is constrained by geographic features like mountains. Even in Yellowstone, one of the last herds to be considered truly free roaming, the herd gets hazed back into the park at their northern boundary. The animal that once moved across the continent in herds so vast that it took days to pass them by, the species that shaped the prairie itself, is now confined to small patches of habitat and is often considered ecologically extinct, so no longer fulfilling their ecological role at the landscape scale. And this has big implications for North American grasslands. The Great Plains are a vast and ecologically important region encompassing over 700 million acres. They provide critical ecosystem services like erosion control and carbon storage. And unfortunately, over 50% of the Great Plains has been converted to agricultural lands. Everything in gray on this map has already been lost, and the purple color is threatened. Each year, over 1 million acres of prairie are converted to other land uses. With that said, the Great Plains shortgrass prairie, which you can see in green, are one of the last great temperate grassland strongholds. So it's really urgent to preserve these lands and manage them sustainably. And the Smithsonian established the Great Plains Science Program in response to these challenges. When you hear the Smithsonian, you might think of the museums in DC or the National Zoo. But the Smithsonian's National Zoo and Conservation Biology Institute is a global effort to save wildlife species from extinction. About 250 scientists and students collaborate with colleagues in more than 25 different countries. And the Smithsonian Great Plains Science Program was launched in 2018. It's a consortium that's based largely in Bozeman, Montana, dedicated to the conservation of temperate grasslands. While we work broadly in the Great Plains region, American Prairie was a founding partner for the program. And American Prairie is an NGO that's conserving and rewilding prairie in Montana as a permanently protected refuge for both wildlife and recreation. The Great Plains Science Program's research funding comes through competitive grants, while the staff salaries and core budget are funded entirely through gifts. Though the Smithsonian is a quasi-federal agency, the Great Plains Science Program doesn't receive any federal funding. So while much of the work of the Great Plains Science Program focuses on the impacts of buffalo restoration, the team also works on numerous other projects, including the reintroduction and movement tracking of the imperiled black-footed ferret, and also the tracking of their prey species, the prairie dogs. It's actually a groundbreaking project tracking prairie dog movements underground and mapping out their burrow systems for the first time. It also helped with the tribally led reintroduction of swift fox to Fort Belknap Indian Reservation, and study the breeding and migratory ecology of imperiled grassland songbirds. So while the vertebrate projects might draw a lot of attention, we also have research focusing on soils, insects, plant composition, and structures mimicking beaver dams. But let's take a closer look at some of the things the Great Plains Science Program has learned from our studies on buffalo restoration. A 2021 study looked at the abundances of 11 grassland songbird species on both buffalo grazed and cattle grazed sites. So these box plots are showing the number of species found at each site where they did point counts. So they went out and listened and looked and recorded all the bird species that they could find at each site. And since these box plots overlap and the means are quite close, it's indicating that the number of species wasn't very different between cattle and bison sites. 2 of these 11 species, the grasshopper sparrow and the vesper sparrow, were more abundant in the bison pastures. But during that project, they noticed a trend in the data that while things were similar in upland grassland habitats, there was a difference between the riparian areas, and by riparian I mean areas next to rivers and streams that were grazed by bison versus cattle. One of the biggest differences between bison and cattle is their behavior around water. Bison are much more drought tolerant and heat tolerant, and they spend much less time close to water. Of the hundreds of hours that I've spent watching bison, anecdotally, I've noticed that they really tend to book it through streams, where if you spent any time with cattle, that is not the case. Studies have found that bison will regularly travel up to 10 kilometers away from water sources, where cattle will typically only travel around 3 kilometers. So a big difference in the vegetation consumption and trampling from bison and cattle near streams, which you can see if you compare these 2 photos. It's even hard to see that there's a stream on the left because there's really no vegetation around that stream. And these riparian corridors are known to be really important movement pathways and habitat for a big variety of species. So the team did a follow-up study focusing on birds, deer, and elk in riparian areas grazed by bison and cattle. Using 20 years of satellite data, our team found that native perennial grasses, shrubs, and trees increased in the bison grazing areas where they remained steady or declining in the cattle grazing areas. And these same changes were found to be associated with more diverse bird communities. So you can see the upward trend on these graphs as the number of species detected increases with increasing cover of each of our vegetation types. Also, at 78 camera trap sites, they found that white-tailed deer and elk also use these restored bison grazing areas much more often. So they found that bison restoration by American Prairie and Fort Belknap Indian Reservation resulted in strong long-term changes that had knock-on positive effects for the whole ecosystem. Dung beetles are also incredibly important for breaking down these patties and releasing the nutrients held in them back into the soil. Dr. Ellen Welty is an entomologist and plant ecologist with the Smithsonian and now Kansas State University. And she looked at what species of dung beetle occur in places grazed by bison, which are the blue dots, and places grazed by cattle. To interpret this plot, all you need to know is that if they're farther apart, they have more different species compositions of dung beetles. And we see really minimal overlap between these blue and green dots, showing they have really different beetle communities. And these red circles are around non-native species. So we have a lot more non-native species found in the cattle plots than the bison plots. So the native species evolved with bison dung and seem to prefer the bison sites. Another really incredibly exciting aspect of our bison focus work is the Intertribal Grasslands Network. So this is a collaboration between 5 tribal communities, their respective buffalo programs, fish and wildlife departments, tribal colleges, and the Smithsonian. So while the Smithsonian is a lead scientific partner in the network, it's a tribally led initiative to explore the impacts of bison restoration on grasslands, informed land management, and understand the impacts of both climate and grazing on rangelands. The network also aims to strengthen cultural ties to nature, enhance livelihoods, and increase capacity within each community through education. So here's a closer look at each of those communities mapped out in northern Montana, and our many partners in the network. Each reservation is in yellow, and then their respective buffalo pastures are in blue. Each year, 160 transects are resampled across 9 buffalo pastures, forming a long-term monitoring data set. So that sampling at each 50-meter transect includes looking at vegetation structure and height, vegetation chemistry, looking at the bison diet from scat, measuring soil carbon and soil chemistry, using audio recorders to monitor grassland songbird communities, and camera traps to look at which mammals visit these sites. So this information helps us manage and monitor changes within the buffalo pastures, both from the bison restoration and changing conditions. This all brings me to my work, which is focused on the movement and behaviors of the bison themselves. So as Corey introduced earlier, I did grow up in the Washington, D.C. area, and my absolute favorite thing to do was visit the National Zoo. I grew up as a city kid, but I've always loved getting outside into wide open spaces, hiking, climbing, and later as part of my work studying these natural systems. So after studying ecology in Colorado, I did an internship with the Smithsonian in Virginia, which turned into a Smithsonian internship in Montana, which turned into a PhD project at Montana State with the Smithsonian Fellowship. And as Corey said, I'm so grateful to work with this species that is so important to so many different people and connects me to a lot of different communities. But my research is all about how bison move as a group and how this variable movement and group structure subsequently impacts the prairie. So much of the impact of bison is mediated through group size and the intensity of grazing. You can imagine that bison spread out into little groups across the prairie would have a really different impact than one big group grazing intensively and then moving on. So I'll share a little bit of an overview of bison sociality before diving into the specifics of my research. Bison have a really high degree of sexual segregation or differences between males and females in both appearance and behavior. So adult males can weigh about 2,000 pounds, and adult females typically weigh half of that. Males also have blockier heads and the more distinct hump in their backs. Both have capes, so furrier areas around their shoulders and beards, but that's more pronounced in males. You can also tell the difference based on the shape of their horns. So male horns will typically go out and then straight up, and they're also quite a bit thicker, whereas female horns will have a more gradual curve. So if you could humor me and raise your hand if you think that this individual with the arrow pointing to it is a male. So half and half. The people who raised their hands would be correct. So this individual is about the same size as the female behind it because it's younger. It's a 2 or 3 year old male. But those horns kind of go out before they go up, where female horns tend to curve more gradually. But there's a lot of variation in both the way bison faces look and their horns are shaped and what their bonnets or their hair looks like. So you can really tell individuals apart sometimes. Females live in these cow-calf herds where you have females of all ages, nursing calves, and younger males. Several studies have conducted bison dominance hierarchies by watching for aggressive interactions. Aggressive interactions between females are much more subtle than the flashy rut mating period displays you see from males, and it's usually expressed by them displacing each other from prime feeding patches, but occasionally can be expressed by them swinging their horns around. So while one study found that dominance hierarchies were based on just pure age of individuals, another study in a place that was more food limited found dominance hierarchies were based on weight, with heavier individuals displacing lighter individuals. So there's some variation there. Indigenous peoples who have lived alongside buffalo for thousands of years understood that the herd is matriarchal and that movements are often led by elder cows. They're often described as living in family groups. This knowledge was preserved and passed down through oral traditions and pictographic records like the Yanktonai Dakota winter count shown here. One study from Utah State University supported the idea of the herd being led by elder females, finding that the oldest females initiated movements after rest periods 81% of the time. Male social groups, on the other hand, are much more variable. So young males will get pushed out of the cow-calf herd when they're 3 or 4 years old, And then they often form bachelor groups, so smaller groups of mixed-age males. Other older males will be solitary or in pairs spread throughout the prairie. So while you see those extreme aggression displays during the mating period between July and August, early September, the rest of the season there's very little aggression between males. Bison sociality and movements are likely heavily impacted by their environment and the degree to which they're constrained. As I mentioned earlier, most bison these days live behind fences, and that's the case with the bison I study at American Prairie. So here's a map of 2 bison pastures at American Prairie, and they're kind of weird shapes, so there's fences surrounding these areas. But even though they're odd shapes, they are quite large. Each of these pastures is over 110 square kilometers, or over 25,000 acres, which for some context is nearly double the size of Manhattan, or for some Yellowstone context is about a third of the size of Lamar Valley. And there's about 500 bison in each of these areas. Today, I'll mainly share some findings from the Sun Prairie pasture, which is that bottom right pasture. And the Sun Prairie pasture has very minimal internal fencing, and they're free roaming to graze year-round. The White Rock pasture is a little more heavily managed, and they're rotated between sub-pastures. So while the dynamics of these semi-free roaming herds may not be completely representative of historic bison movements, this is representative of most bison today. So it's important to understand how their ecological impact changes based on the size of pastures and the number of individuals in a herd. The more intensive management at these reserves also allows us to conduct studies that wouldn't be possible in a really wild environment. American Prairie handles each of their bison about every 2 years for routine disease testing. So this is the system of corrals and squeeze chutes they use during these handling events. And we can take advantage of these handlings to put tracking devices and collect samples from a large proportion of individuals in the herds. So while they're in the squeeze chute, we take some hair samples so we can get genetic data to look at how related all the individuals are to each other and to monitor stress hormones. And then we track the movement of these bison with GPS ear tags. So we've used 2 different brands of these GPS ear tags. The left are the Movement brand. You can tell they were developed for cattle. And then the series tags are the ones we've used in the last few years. So they're both send locations. The Movement tag worked with local towers, and then the series tag connects to satellite. And both are much less expensive than traditional tracking collars. So those traditional collars you see on tracked individuals cost thousands of dollars each, where these are more few hundred a pop. So we can actually put them out on many individuals at once. We have put over 400 tags out over the last 5 years, which, depending on the herd and the year, is between 30 and 90% of adult females. So we get locations from them about every 4 hours. And that gives us data like this. So each dot is an individual moving over the month of May, and you can see time ticking away at the top there. So during May, they're in their calving period, and a lot of aspects of bison sociality change with the seasons, both because of changing vegetation conditions and because of their biological state. So during this calving and time with abundant grass availability, they're in these much smaller groups. So now compare that movement to this movement in August. At this point, the grass has dried out, and they're moving around in much bigger groups. This is also driven by the mating season. I didn't think that would have audio. Let me turn that off. Sorry about that. There's a little video I took of the rut from my truck doing behavioral observations. So if you go into Yellowstone from late July to early August, you can see bison literally butting heads, bashing into each other, like in that video. And while the cow and the calf herds typically move in larger groups, with males in their separate solitary bachelor groups, males and females will come together during the rut and primarily use larger open areas. So you can see that in both seasons, there are times when bison are in these much larger groups and times when they split off into subgroups. So these groups are really dynamic, but we don't know that much about what actually drives different group composition over time outside of these seasonal changes. So the first questions I had for my dissertation work were pretty basic. How does their social structure work? Well, we know a fair amount about dominance hierarchies and behaviors from really small, intensively studied herds. It's difficult to study group dynamics on a landscape level scale. Studying how individuals move in relation to each other is cost intensive and logistically challenging, so we actually don't know a lot about what's going on when they split up and merge together. And because of how bison are often described as living in family groups, we expected to see some stable subgroups come out of the data that are based on relatedness. So to answer these questions, we supplemented the movement data with fine-scale behavioral observations to determine which individuals were associated by proximity with each other. My friend Johnny and I spent 350 hours sitting in a hot truck looking at the buffalo herds between May and September of 2021 in this smaller pasture called Dry Fork. So this one wasn't on the map, but it was small enough that we could actually get enough data from behavioral observations. So we randomly selected a focal individual, like this individual circled in red, and then we noted the ID tags and distance of all individuals that were within 5 body lengths of the focal individual. So we can tell who's who by their numbered ear tags, like you can see in that upper left photo. So we selected a new focal individual every 15 minutes and repeated this process about 2,000 times. Social network analysis is a way to look at which individuals are connected to each other, and they're often visualized by having circles representing individuals, and then the width of the line connecting the circles representing the strength of the relationship between pairs. So 2 bison that spend a ton of time together, best friends, will have a big, thicker line, and bison that aren't together very often will have a thinner line. And if they are never appear together, they'll have no line between them at all. So this figure shows some different ways that these networks can look. So this one kind of just looks like a big blob. They're all interacting pretty evenly with each other, and that would be a low modularity network. So these are going to appear on this scale from low to high modularity. So modularity is how modular the networks are, how groupy or clustered they are. And if we look at some intermediate modularity, you start to see some structure emerge where there's some individuals that interact more with each other than they do with any other groups. And then the extreme would be stable subgroups that don't interact with each other at all. So these are just examples of the way networks can look. And I constructed these social networks from 2 different bison pastures with both the fine-scale observation data and the movement tracking data. And I'll show the results in the same grid. So there'll be 4 networks that are each from different pastures, different sampling types. And so here are those resulting networks that look pretty darn blobby. We found no evidence for stable subgroups emerging from these networks. And they had really, really low modularity values, basically right at 0. So this shows that there weren't subgroups that were stable over the whole growing season, because this is aggregated from about May to September. So you might look at this and think that this means that we didn't see any breaking off into subgroups. We also don't see a lot of clustering of individuals of a similar age. So the darker dots are older females, and then the squares, which you see we don't have very many of, are the squares. And most of our squares are younger, yearling, 2-year-old individuals, because we're mainly looking at the cow-calf herd. So from time in the field, and from looking at visualizations like we saw earlier, we know that these bison do have really dynamic groups. We're not seeing these low modularity, blobby networks because they're consistently in one big group. So to illustrate this point, we constructed networks from each single day in the data set. So here, each dot is a network constructed from who was by who in each day. So we had some days where they're all together in one big group, and some days where they're broken off into smaller subgroups that didn't interact, and then a lot in between. When we create networks for each week, we see the average modularity drop way down. Most individuals have interacted with each other in the scope of a week. When we get to a month, those modularity values are all right around 0. So this is indicating that while we do have dynamic groups, the subgroups aren't stable over time. Some individuals aren't clustering into subgroups at the scale of months or even most weeks. And from the genetic sampling, we also didn't find that relatedness was correlated with stronger bonds. So individuals that were more related outside of cow-calf pairs, because we excluded calves from the data set, and outside of just some mother one-year-old offspring relationships, beyond that, more related individuals were not more likely to spend time together. So we observed this lack of social structure and lack of family groups that we expected to see. And this could be the way the bison behave, or it could be the result of our more intensive management. 500 bison could be a small enough group that they can all operate as one big herd, where you might see more stable subgroup structure appear when you have larger herds. But in a larger herd, there aren't very many of them, and it's hard to track enough individuals to really tell. It also could be that bison are frequently moved between pastures, both to maintain genetic diversity and control population sizes, since they are constrained by the fences. So when we move these individuals between herds, we could be disrupting the social structure. But having more flexibility in group structure could be really advantageous for bison to be able to respond dynamically to changing foraging conditions. Greenup progresses unevenly across the prairie due to changes in elevation, precipitation, or more fine-scale differences like plant composition or soil type. Which leads me to my second set of questions. Where and when do groups break apart and come back together? And how is this related to the distribution of vegetation on the landscape? Understanding what drives group dynamics, whether it's social forces or the environment, helps us predict how bison will behave and graze in new management scenarios. We refer to these events where groups split and merge as fission and fusion events. So fission is where groups split apart into subgroups, like you can see in this example. We can watch that one more time. And then fusion events is where multiple subgroups merge back together. So I came up with a process that I'm happy to talk about more in depth if anyone's interested. Got any movement ecologists in the room? How to define groups and identify fission and fusion events. So here is an animation of the resulting defined groups changing over time. So each circle here is one individual, but there's many circles of the same color overlapping, so it's hard to tell how many individuals you're looking at. But the size of the circle represents our uncertainty around where they're located, which we use in our fission-fusion group definitions. So in this animation, individuals that are the same color are sorted into the same groups. And then whenever there's a change in color, like right there, that is a fission and fusion event. So like we saw from the movement examples earlier, there are seasonal patterns to group size. So the y-axis here is average group size experienced by a bison, expressed as like percent of the herd that they're with. So low values are smaller groups, and then high values are bigger groups. So when they're all the way up to 1, that's the average bison is with 100% of all the other bison in the herd. So we see that group size drops to its lowest point in May around calving, and then increases over the summer, peaking around rut, and then goes back down to an intermediate group sizes in the winter. So even when we account for these seasonal patterns, there's a fair amount of variation in group size within that. And I wanted to see if vegetation patterns are driving that vegetation. So we can see how, once we control for seasons, likelihood of fission and fusion events changes based on the distribution of grass forage quality within the pasture. So I created this metric for forage quality, That represents the nitrogen to carbon ratio that we made from combining information from our collected vegetation chemistry with satellite imagery. So the purple represents areas with higher nitrogen, and nitrogen's building block of amino acids and proteins. So more purple is more protein and more nutritious grasses. So here's one of the first things we found from our preliminary results. The probability of fission, or the likelihood that a group will split apart in any given time, is dependent on both group size and how variable or patchy the vegetation is. So large groups, which are in green, were much more sensitive and responsive to patterns in vegetation than our intermediate groups in blue and our small groups in red. So bison, especially in large groups, were more likely to break apart when there's moderate variation or patchiness in the vegetation. And this aligns with what we'd expect from theory. So on the far left side of this graph, we have really homogeneous areas where no matter what direction you go, the grass is going to be pretty similar. So there's not a lot of conflict of interest between individuals in a group. On the other end of the spectrum, if you have a really patchy environment with these small, dense patches, that will usually lead to the formation of stable, smaller groups to best exploit those patches. So it's that intermediate variability where we expect more fission-fusion, which is what we saw from our data. So there's more that I'm still digging into here, including how distance to things like water and fences impact these dynamics. The size of a group in an area determines how intensively the area is grazed, and that varying grazing intensity creates the mosaic of habitats that support a diversity of other species. For example, mountain plovers like really short grass prairie, like you could see on the left, while chestnut-collared longspurs and Sprague's pipit like more intermediate, taller grass heights. A lot of songbirds also rely on cottonwood willow corridors, like you can see on the right. Another big source of heterogeneity is these bison wallows that I mentioned earlier. So bison roll around and create these bare patches in the soil, and when they do so, they drop seeds that are stored in their fur, collected in their fur, into these wallows. So these wallows will have unique seed banks and unique plant compositions right around them. So they create disturbance that different types of species can thrive in. These wallows can also be ephemeral pools where they can fill up with water and provide important habitat for amphibians throughout the prairie. So we talked about how bison group size creates a mosaic in the prairie, but wallows are another part of that mosaic created by their behavior instead of their foraging pattern. And so while there's been a number of studies showing that wallows increase biodiversity, we haven't seen a lot about the scale that this occurs on. So to be able to see where wallows occur on these landscapes, I collected imagery with a fixed-wing drone. You can see me holding here in my very cool-looking hat. So this drone doesn't hover, so it always has to be moving forward. So you have to throw it into the wind, which the mini heart attacks from throwing this thing worth tens of thousands of dollars multiple times a day has probably taken a few years off my life. It also stressfully has to crash land, like you can see there. And that one went pretty well, but the prairie is covered in rocks and shrubs and cacti, which don't like the styrofoam body of this drone. But amidst all those challenges, we flew the drone on 45 randomly selected sites. So these are 500 by 500 meter plots. You can see spread out over the same pastures that I showed you earlier. And then I hired this great undergrad student from Montana State, Leif Bransness, to do the tedious task of scouring the drone imagery to look for every single wallow. And he annotated over 1,000 wallows across all of these sites, drawing circles around each of them so we could measure both their shape and their size. And he found that the average plot had about 30 wallows, but there's a lot of variation, with some having as many as 200. So each wallow was about 8 square meters and 3.5 meters wide, which makes sense because bison themselves are about 3 meters wide. When they roll in, create a bison-shaped depression in the soil. And if we scale this density of wallows we observed to the whole bison pasture, Sun Prairie alone could have well over 13,000 wallows. And we wanted to see if we could explain the variation in wallow density between sites. So we created a land cover model where we characterize all this drone imagery as herbaceous vegetation in green, shrubs in yellow, and bare dirt in brown. And you can see the wallow locations are the blue dots. They're kind of hard to see, seeing where they're spread out in this one 500-meter plot. We also characterized how green all of the areas in the drone imagery were. So greenness is kind of a metric for how photosynthetic and productive these grasslands are. And also used our movement data to characterize how much bison use each site. So from our land cover types, cover of bare ground was actually more important, and this is after we took out the area of the actual wallows. There were more wallows in areas that were more green and areas that bison use more. So wallows will be formed where there's healthy growing vegetation, high bison use, but still has enough variability in the landscape where there's bare ground for the wallows to establish. And we're now using these annotated wallows as training data for a machine learning algorithm, and we're hoping to be able to identify wallows at a larger scale from aerial imagery that the state captures about every 2 years. So if we can do that, we can see how long wallows persist over time to learn how quickly they establish after reintroduction. But from what we've seen, it seems like they form pretty fast. Since one area we measured had only had bison in it for 4 months, but it had similar wallow density to the areas that had had bison for 20 years. So another aspect of my work that just getting into now, don't have results from yet, involves using that same drone imagery to link the intensity of grazing at the interval at which bison revisit a site to vegetation growth. So we can see where on the trajectory of grass growth bison tend to visit and how this varies across the landscape and how it subsequently impacts landscape productivity. So we've learned that in these heavily managed contexts, we don't see the stable subgroups or family groups that we expected, and that could be adaptive for bison groups to be able to respond dynamically to changing environmental conditions. We're teasing out what drives these group dynamics and how the impacts of grazing changes when bison are in different sized groups. And we're investigating that other source of heterogeneity, our bison wallows, and seeing what scale they occur and impact biodiversity. Together, these mechanisms explain why a prairie with bison looks so much different than a prairie with cattle. And the tools we're developing will help us measure these phenomena at scales that we couldn't before. There's a lot of momentum behind bison restoration these days. Tribal nations are leading some of the most ambitious restoration projects on the continent. Land trusts like American Prairie are working to restore bison at a landscape scale. And a lot of our beautiful federal and state lands have buffalo. So the decisions being made right now, like how big do we make these pastures, how many bison do we put on them, where do we put our fences, will affect how the prairie looks for generation to come. So this work, and that of the Great Plains Science Program, aims to make those decisions as evidence-based as possible. Bison clearly shape the prairie, but after their long absence, we're still learning exactly how. So thank you all so much for joining me. If you're interested in staying connected with the Great Plains Science Program, you can scan that QR code to sign up for the newsletter. There's also some materials in the front if you're interested in hearing more. But it was such a pleasure to talk to you today, and I'm really happy to take any questions. Chat Bison.